Mr. George Rodney was driving past a quiet, low-cost neighborhood where he ran into a single mom and her daughter stranded outside an apartment building. It was about 10:56 p.m. He was returning from visiting a friend who had just lost his daughter shortly after birth. The weight of that tragedy still pressed against his chest as he gripped the steering wheel of his black Mercedes, navigating streets he'd never traveled before. George had taken the back roads through the Riverside district to avoid the heavy traffic on the highway to his house in the affluent North Shore. The neighborhood was dimly lit. Streetlights flickered overhead like dying fireflies. Most windows were dark. Working people lived here, people who rose before dawn and collapsed into bed before midnight. But as George slowed at a stop sign, his attention was drawn to two figures huddled on the concrete steps of a weathered apartment building, a woman and a little girl. The woman was kneeling, her arms wrapped protectively around the child, who clutched a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. They would later be known to him as Rachel Williams and Mercy Williams. But in that moment, they were simply two souls in distress, illuminated by the pale glow of his headlights. George hesitated. His executive training told him to keep driving. Don't get involved. You have a 7 a.m. meeting with the board. You're exhausted. This isn't your responsibility. But something about the scene held him. Maybe it was the way the little girl's head rested against her mother's shoulder. Maybe it was the memory of his friend's empty arms just hours earlier. Maybe it was the fact that the woman wasn't begging or making a scene. She was just sitting there, defeated, as if she'd run out of options and was simply waiting for whatever came next. George pulled over. He stepped out of the car, and the cool October air bit at his skin. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the pavement as he approached. "Excuse me," he called out gently. "Are you all right?" The woman's head snapped up. Even in the dim light, George could see the exhaustion etched into her features. She was African American, early 30s perhaps, with natural hair pulled back into a hasty bun. Her eyes were red-rimmed but sharp, with the kind of intelligence that poverty hadn't dulled. "We're fine," she said automatically, her voice hoarse. She pulled her daughter closer. George stopped a respectful distance away. "I don't mean to intrude, but it's almost 11 o'clock at night, and you're sitting outside with your daughter. That doesn't look fine to me." The woman's jaw tightened. For a moment, George thought she might tell him to mind his own business, but then her shoulders sagged, and something crumbled in her expression. "We got locked out," she whispered. I couldn't make rent this month. The landlord changed the locks 4 hours ago. Mommy said we're going on an adventure," the little girl said suddenly, her voice small but brave. "We're camping." George's heart constricted. The child couldn't have been more than 4 years old. "What's your name?" George asked, crouching down to the girl's level. "Mercy," she said, hugging her rabbit tighter. "This is Mr. Hoppy." "That's a very fine rabbit, Mercy." George looked up at the mother. "And you are?" "Rachel. Rachel Williams." She said it with a dignity that refused to be stripped away by circumstance. "Look, I appreciate your concern, but we'll figure something out. I have some family I can call in the morning." "It's not morning yet," George said quietly. "It's cold, and getting colder. Do you have anywhere to go tonight?" Rachel's silence was answer enough. George made a decision that would change both their lives, though neither of them knew it yet. "There's a hotel about 10 minutes from here. The Riverside Inn. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and safe." He pulled out his wallet. "Let me get you a room for the night. You and Mercy can sleep in actual beds, take hot showers, order room service if you're hungry." Rachel's eyes widened. "I can't accept that." I don't even know you. My name is George Rodney. Now you know me." He held out several crisp $100 bills. "Please, consider it a loan if it makes you feel better. Pay me back when you're on your feet." Rachel stared at the money, as if it might vanish if she reached for it. Why would you do this for a complete stranger? George thought of his friend's grief-stricken face, the tiny coffin they'd never expected to need, the randomness of suffering, and the arbitrary nature of who gets saved and who doesn't. "Because someone should," he said simply. Rachel took the money with trembling hands. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she quickly wiped them away, not wanting Mercy to see. "Thank you," she whispered. Thank you." George followed them to the Riverside Inn in his Mercedes, ensuring they got checked in safely. He watched through the glass doors as Rachel spoke with the desk clerk, as Mercy clutched her mother's hand and peered around the modest lobby with wide eyes. When Rachel turned back and gave him a small wave of gratitude, George nodded and drove away, assuming he'd never see her again. He assumed wrong. 3 days later, George sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Rodney Holdings Tower in downtown Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Lake Michigan that had cost the company's interior designer a small fortune to optimize. His assistant, Claire, had just brought him his third coffee of the morning and a stack of folders that needed his attention before the compliance meeting at 2. George was the CEO of Rodney Holdings, a conglomerate with interests in manufacturing, logistics, and international trade. He'd built the company from a modest inheritance into a $2 billion empire over 15 years of relentless work. At 38, he was one of the youngest CEOs of a Fortune 500 company. He was also unmarried, childless, and increasingly aware that success had cost him most of the relationships that once mattered. "George, you need to look at this." His chief legal officer, Marcus Chen, entered without knocking, a privilege reserved for only 3 people in the organization. "Good morning to you too, Marcus. This can't wait." Marcus dropped a folder on George's mahogany desk. "It's about the Gazprom investigation." George's attention sharpened immediately. Gazprom Incorporated was a mid-sized energy consultancy firm that Rodney Holdings was in the process of acquiring. The deal was worth $400 million and would expand their portfolio significantly into the renewable energy sector. "What about it?" "Our forensic accountants found irregularities, significant ones. There's evidence of fund misappropriation, potentially fraudulent reporting to investors, maybe even money laundering." Marcus's expression was grim. "The corruption goes deep, George. Senior management is implicated." George's jaw tightened. "How senior?" "C-level. We're talking about executives who'll be integrated into our leadership if this acquisition goes through." Marcus opened the folder. "We've identified 4 individuals who had access to the accounts in question. We're running background checks and freezing their assets pending investigation." George pulled the folder closer and began scanning the names and photographs. And then he stopped. His blood ran cold. Staring back at him from a corporate headshot was a face he'd seen just 72 hours earlier, exhausted and desperate, sitting on apartment steps in a neighborhood he never visited. Rachel Williams, Chief Operations Officer, Gazprom Incorporated. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We share real stories of kindness, redemption, and unexpected connections that remind us we're all more connected than we think. And drop a comment below telling us, have you ever helped a stranger only to meet them again in the most unexpected way? We'd love to hear your stories. George read the file 3 times, certain he was making a mistake. But there was no mistake. Rachel Williams, 32 years old, MBA, from Northwestern University, 15 years of experience in operations and strategic planning. She'd been with Gazprom Incorporated for 8 years, promoted to COO 3 years ago. According to the preliminary investigation, her corporate accounts had been frozen 4 days ago, just before George had found her locked out of her apartment. Marcus, George said slowly, what exactly is Rachel Williams accused of? Marcus leaned against the desk. She had signing authority on several accounts where the irregularities occurred. Payments to shell companies, inflated contractor fees, that sort of thing. Whether she was actively involved or just negligently overseeing is unclear. That's what we're investigating. Has she been interviewed? She's not responding to our legal team's calls or emails, which, frankly, makes her look guilty. When your assets are frozen and you're implicated in a fraud investigation, going silent is not a good strategy. George thought of Mercy clutching Mr. Hoppy, of Rachel's dignified refusal to accept charity, even when she had nowhere to sleep. Or maybe, George said carefully, she's dealing with a personal crisis that makes checking corporate email difficult. Marcus frowned. Do you know something I don't? George closed the folder. Give me 24 hours. I want to talk to her myself before we proceed. George, that's not protocol. We have lawyers for. I know what we have lawyers for. But I'm the CEO, and this acquisition was my initiative. I want to look her in the eye and understand what happened before we destroy her career. George's tone left no room for argument. 24 hours, Marcus. That's all I'm asking. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded. 24 hours. But if she lawyers up or refuses to cooperate, we move forward with the investigation as planned. Understood. Finding Rachel Williams proved easier than George expected. Her last known address before the eviction was in the building where he'd found her. But George suspected she wouldn't be there. He tried the Riverside Inn first. The desk clerk was the same tired-looking man who'd checked Rachel in 3 nights earlier. He remembered George men in $1,000 suits weren't common in this neighborhood. The lady with the little girl? The clerk nodded. They checked out yesterday morning, paid for an extra night herself, in cash. Seemed like she was trying to figure out her next move. Did she leave a forwarding address? No, but... The clerk hesitated. She asked about weekly rentals. I gave her a list of places that don't require credit checks. Maybe try the Elmwood Apartments on 5th? That's usually where people go when they're in transition. George tipped him generously and drove to 5th Street. The Elmwood Apartments were a step down from the Riverside Inn. The building's exterior paint was peeling, and the parking lot was potholed and poorly lit. But it was shelter, and George understood that when you're drowning, you don't critique the life raft. He found Rachel's name on the buzzer for Unit 2C and pressed it. A long silence. Then, yes? Rachel, it's George Rodney, the man who helped you 3 nights ago. I need to talk to you. Another silence. Longer. This time. How did you find me? I'm very resourceful. Please, Rachel. It's important. 5 minutes. The buzzer sounded, unlocking the door. George climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, noting the faint smell of mildew and the flickering fluorescent lights. He knocked on 2C. Rachel opened the door but didn't invite him in. She looked worse than she had 3 nights ago. No sleep, no rest, just grinding stress that was eating her alive. What do you want? She asked. Not hostile, just exhausted beyond the capacity for pleasantries. I want to understand what's happening with you and Gazprom Incorporated, George said quietly. The color drained from Rachel's face. How do you? Who are you? I'm George Rodney, CEO of Rodney Holdings, the company that's acquiring Gazprom. He kept his voice gentle. Our forensic accountants flagged your name in an investigation. Your accounts are frozen. You're implicated in potential fraud. And instead of responding to our legal team, you're hiding in a weekly rental with your daughter. Rachel's hand gripped the doorframe so tightly her knuckles went white. I'm not hiding. I'm surviving. Then help me understand. Talk to me, Rachel. Off the record. Just you and me. For a moment, George thought she'd slam the door in his face. But then her shoulders sagged in that same way they had 3 nights ago, and she stepped aside. 5 minutes, she said. The apartment was sparse. A small living room with a futon, a kitchenette with a hot plate, a closed door that probably led to a bedroom where Mercy was sleeping. Rachel didn't offer George a seat. They stood in the tiny living room. 2 strangers connected by a chance encounter and a corporate investigation. I didn't steal anything, Rachel said without preamble. I didn't commit fraud. I didn't even know what was happening until it was too late. Tell me what did happen. Rachel wrapped her arms around herself. Gazprom's CFO is a man named David Keller. Brilliant, charming. Everyone loved him, including me. For a while, he recruited me 8 years ago, mentored me, promoted me to COO. I trusted him completely. George said nothing. Just listen. 6 months ago, I started noticing irregularities, payments to contractors I didn't recognize, budget line items that didn't make sense. I asked David about it. He said it was a restructuring, nothing to worry about, that I needed to focus on operations and let him handle finance. Rachel's voice grew bitter. I should have pressed harder. I should have gone to the board. But I trusted him. And by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. What was happening? David was siphoning money, millions, creating shell companies, inflating contracts, paying himself and a few others through fake consulting fees. He was good at it, covered his tracks, forged authorizations, made it look like legitimate business expenses. Rachel met George's eyes. And he used my credentials to do some of it. My signature, my accounts. When the investigation started, my name was all over the paperwork. Did you go to the authorities? I went to Gazprom's internal compliance team. They launched an investigation, but David got wind of it. He disappeared, just vanished, along with whatever money he hadn't already moved offshore. Rachel's laugh was hollow. The investigators froze all suspect accounts, including mine. My salary stopped. My savings were locked down. I had $3,000 in cash that I'd taken out for an emergency fund, and that's what I've been living on for 4 days. George processed this. Why didn't you respond to our legal team's inquiries? Because I don't have a lawyer. Do you know how much a corporate defense attorney costs? I can't afford that. I can barely afford food. Rachel's composure finally cracked. I spent 15 years building my career. I worked 80-hour weeks. I sacrificed time with my daughter. I did everything right. And now I'm being treated like a criminal because I was too trusting and too naive to see what David was doing right under my nose. Tears streamed down her face, and she angrily wiped them away. George made another decision. What if I told you I believe you? Rachel stared at him. Why would you believe me? You don't know me. No, but I know people. I've spent 20 years learning to read character, to distinguish between someone who's guilty and someone who's been wronged. And everything about you, from the way you protected your daughter 3 nights ago to the way you're handling this nightmare now, tells me you're not a thief. George pulled out his phone. I have the best corporate attorneys in Chicago. I'm going to connect you with them. They'll represent you pro bono. I can't accept. Yes, you can. And you will. Because your daughter needs her mother to be free and clear of this mess. And because I won't let a corrupt CFO destroy an innocent woman's life. George's tone was firm. You're going to cooperate fully with the investigation. You're going to provide every piece of evidence you have. And we're going to prove that you're a victim, not a perpetrator. Rachel covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed. Why are you doing this? George thought about that question. He thought about random chance and inexplicable connections. He thought about driving through a neighborhood he never visited, at a time he normally wouldn't be driving at all, and finding 2 people who needed help. Because 3 nights ago, I was in a dark place emotionally. I'd just left a friend who'd lost everything that mattered to him. And then I saw you and Mercy, and I had a choice. I could drive past, or I could stop. I stopped, and it made me feel like maybe there's still some point to all of this. He gestured at the cramped apartment. Maybe we're supposed to help each other. Maybe that's the whole point. Over the next 2 weeks, George's legal team worked with Rachel to build her defense. They uncovered email chains that proved she'd questioned the irregular transactions. They found audit requests she'd submitted that David Keller had blocked. They traced the shell companies back to offshore accounts, controlled exclusively by Keller and 2 other executives, none of which Rachel had access to. The evidence was overwhelming. Rachel Williams was not only innocent, she was the whistleblower who'd triggered the investigation in the first place. George attended every meeting. He reviewed every document. And the more he learned about Rachel's career, the more impressed he became. She was brilliant. Her strategic planning had increased Gazprom's operational efficiency by 30% over 3 years. She'd negotiated contracts that saved the company millions. She'd implemented training programs that reduced employee turnover. She was exactly the kind of executive George wanted in his organization. Marcus, George said one afternoon, when this acquisition goes through, I want Rachel Williams on our team. Marcus raised an eyebrow. In what capacity? Chief Operations Officer. For the entire conglomerate, not just the Gazprom division. George, she hasn't been officially cleared yet. The optics, she will be cleared. I'm certain of it. And when she is, I want her to have a future, a real one. Not just exoneration, but opportunity. George leaned back in his chair. Besides, we need someone in operations who actually understands ethics and integrity. Someone who'll blow the whistle when things go wrong instead of covering it up. Marcus smiled. You really believe in her? I do. Before we continue, I want to take a moment to remind you that stories like this happen every day, small acts of kindness that ripple out in ways we never expect. If this story is touching your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next story. We've got some incredible ones coming up that you won't want to miss. 3 weeks after George first found Rachel on those apartment steps, the investigation concluded. David Keller was apprehended in Costa Rica, attempting to board a flight to a country with no extradition treaty. The FBI charged him with wire fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement. 2 other Gazprom executives were similarly charged. Rachel Williams was fully exonerated. Her accounts were unfrozen. Her reputation was restored. George invited her to his office to deliver the news personally. She arrived in professional attire, a navy suit that she'd clearly owned for years, but that still conveyed competence and dignity. Her hair was styled, her shoulders were back, and George could see the woman she'd been before desperation had stripped her down to survival mode. "Please sit," George said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Rachel sat, her hands folded in her lap. "Claire said you had news." "You've been cleared. Completely. The FBI confirmed that you had no knowledge of Keller's activities and that you actually attempted to report them through proper channels. You're a victim and a whistleblower, not a criminal." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Thank God. Thank God." She pressed her hands to her face. "I've been so scared. For weeks. Scared they'd take Mercy away. Scared I'd lose everything. Scared I'd never work again. You're going to work again. In fact, you're going to work here, if you'll accept my offer." Rachel lowered her hands. "What offer?" "Chief Operations Officer. Rodney Holdings. Full executive compensation package, including relocation assistance, signing bonus, and benefits that'll ensure Mercy has everything she needs. You'll oversee operations across all our subsidiaries. It's a bigger role than what you had at Gazprom, and frankly, you're overqualified for what they were paying you." George slid a folder across the desk. "This is the offer letter. Take your time reviewing it. Hire a lawyer to look it over if you want. There's no pressure." Rachel opened the folder with trembling hands. Her eyes widened as she scanned the numbers. George, this is more than generous. This is life-changing. You've earned it. And I need someone I can trust in that role. Someone who understands that doing the right thing matters more than convenience or profit." George leaned forward. "I want to build a company that means something, Rachel. Not just a company that makes money, but one that treats people with dignity, one that gives second chances, one that recognizes that sometimes the best people are the ones who've been knocked down and gotten back up. I think you can help me do that." Rachel was crying openly now, not bothering to hide it. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes, and then go get Mercy from wherever you've been paying someone to watch her for the last hour, and take her somewhere fun. Take the rest of the week off. Celebrate. You've been through hell, Rachel. You deserve a moment to breathe." Rachel accepted the offer. She started at Rodney Holdings 6 weeks later, after the Gazprom acquisition was finalized, and after she'd found a beautiful 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood with good schools. George attended her first day, introducing her to the executive team and making it clear that she had his full support and confidence. Over the following months, Rachel proved to be everything George had hoped for and more. She streamlined operations, identified inefficiencies, and implemented systems that saved the company millions while improving employee satisfaction. She was tough but fair, demanding but compassionate, and gradually, George and Rachel developed a friendship. They'd have coffee in his office some mornings, discussing business but also life. Rachel told him about Mercy's adjustment to her new preschool, about the relief of financial stability, about the nightmares that still woke her some nights, dreams of being locked out, of having nowhere to go. George told her about the loneliness of success, about building an empire and realizing that empires are cold places without people you love. He told her about his friend's loss, about how that night had changed something in him, made him question what he was doing with his life. "Do you ever think about how random it all was?" Rachel asked one morning, cradling her coffee cup. "If you'd taken the highway instead of cutting through Riverside, if you'd driven past, If I'd managed to scrape together rent that month, none of this would have happened. I think about it all the time, George admitted. And I'm grateful it happened the way it did. Not the part where you suffered, I'd erase that if I could. But the part where we met. The part where I was in the right place at the right time to help. The part where helping you ended up helping me too. Rachel smiled. How did it help you? George considered the question. It reminded me that life is about more than quarterly earnings and market share. It reminded me that people matter. That small acts of kindness have consequences we can't predict. That sometimes the best investments we make aren't in companies or stocks, but in people. You're getting philosophical in your old age, Rachel teased. I'm 38. That's not old, says the man with gray at his temples. George laughed a genuine, unguarded laugh that surprised him with its ease. 6 months after Rachel started at Rodney Holdings, George invited her and Mercy to a company picnic. It was an annual event, held at a sprawling park outside the city, where employees and their families could relax and enjoy a summer day without the pressure of quarterly targets and board meetings. George watched Mercy run through the grass, chasing other children, her laughter carrying across the field. She'd grown since that night outside the apartment building. She was healthier, happier, more confident. Rachel stood beside him, watching her daughter, with the expression of a parent who survived the unthinkable and come out the other side. She doesn't remember much about that time, Rachel said quietly. The eviction, the hotel, the fear. She just remembers the nice man with the fancy car who took us on an adventure. Rachel glanced at George. That's you. You're the nice man. I'm glad she doesn't remember the bad parts, George said. Childhood should be about safety and joy, not survival. Because of you it is. Because of you she has both. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Mercy play. George, Rachel said eventually, can I ask you something? Of course. That night you found us. You said you were coming from visiting a friend who'd lost his daughter. I've always wondered. How is he doing? George's expression grew somber. He's struggling. His marriage is barely holding together. He's in therapy, but grief like that doesn't have a timeline. Some days are better than others. Have you told him about us? About Mercy and me? I have. I told him that on the worst night of my life emotionally, I found 2 people who needed help, and that helping them gave me a reason to keep moving forward. He said it gave him hope, that maybe there's still meaning in the world, even when it feels like everything is meaningless. Rachel's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Tell him that his daughter mattered, that her brief life had ripples, that because of his grief, you were in a certain place at a certain time, and that saved us. Tell him that Mercy is alive and thriving in part because his daughter existed, even if only for a moment. George's throat tightened. I'll tell him. He'll appreciate that more than you know. The seasons changed. Fall arrived, then winter, then spring. Rodney Holdings thrived under the leadership of its CEO and its new COO. The company expanded into 3 new markets, launched an ethics initiative that became a model for other corporations, and was named one of the best places to work in America. George and Rachel's friendship deepened. They challenged each other, supported each other, and built something neither had expected, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. One evening, George invited Rachel to dinner at an upscale restaurant overlooking the Chicago River. It wasn't a business dinner. There was no agenda, no contracts to discuss. Just 2 friends sharing a meal. Mercy asked me something yesterday, Rachel said, as they waited for their entrees. She asked if you were going to be her daddy someday. George nearly choked on his wine. "What did you say?" Rachel laughed. "I told her that you're a very good friend, and that not all good men become daddies. But that doesn't make them less important in our lives." She paused. "But it made me think about what you've become to us, about what we've become to you." George set down his glass carefully. "And what have we become? Family, I think. Not in the traditional sense, but in the sense that matters. You're the person I call when something goes wrong. You're the person Mercy asks about when you haven't visited in a while. You're the person whose opinion I value most, whose support means everything." Rachel met his eyes. "We're connected, George. Not by blood, but by something maybe more powerful. By choice. By chance. By whatever cosmic accident brought us together that night." George felt something shift in his chest. A recognition. An acknowledgement of truth he'd been avoiding. "I care about you," he said simply. "Both of you. More than I expected. More than I probably should, given that we work together and that relationships are complicated." "They are complicated," Rachel agreed. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe complicated is better than lonely." They sat with that truth for a moment, neither rushing to define or label what existed between them. "I don't know what this becomes," George said finally. "I don't have a roadmap for this. But I know that finding you and Mercy was the best thing that's happened to me in years, maybe ever. And whatever this is, friendship, partnership, family, something more, I want to protect it." "Then we'll protect it together," Rachel said. "No rush, no pressure, just honest and present and grateful for however this unfolds." George raised his glass. "To however this unfolds." Rachel clinked her glass against his. "To cosmic accidents and second chances and the courage to stop when you could have driven past." They drank to that, to the randomness of kindness and the intentionality of love, to the ways we save each other and the ways we're saved, often without knowing it. Final pause. 2 years later, George Rodney stood in a small church in downtown Chicago. Rachel Williams stood beside him, radiant in a simple white dress. Mercy Williams, now 6 years old, stood in front of them in a lavender flower girl dress, holding Mr. Hoppy and grinning from ear to ear. George's friend, the one who'd lost his daughter, stood as best man. He'd slowly rebuilt his life, found therapy that helped, learned to carry his grief without being crushed by it. And he'd watched George transform from a lonely executive into a man who laughed easily, who came home to a family, who understood that wealth meant nothing without people to share it with. The ceremony was brief. The vows were simple. The promises were profound. When the officiant pronounced them married, George kissed his wife gently, and Mercy cheered so loudly that the small gathering of friends and family laughed through their tears. At the reception, Rachel pulled George aside for a moment, away from the celebration. "Do you remember what you said to me that night?" she asked. "When I asked why you were helping us, I said because someone should." "No." "After that, you said, maybe we're supposed to help each other. Maybe that's the whole point." Rachel took his hand. "You were right. That is the whole point. We're supposed to find each other in the darkness and offer light. We're supposed to stop when we could drive past. We're supposed to believe in second chances, in redemption, in the possibility that strangers can become family." George pulled her close. "I almost didn't stop that night. But you did. And everything changed." "Everything changed," George echoed. They returned to the reception, to Mercy's laughter, and the toasts from friends, and the music that filled the air with joy. And later that night, When the celebration ended and they returned home to the house they now shared, to the life they'd built together, George thought about chance and choice, about loss and finding, about the ways we're connected without knowing it. He thought about a single moment of kindness on a dark street in a forgotten neighborhood. And he understood finally what his friend's grief had taught him. That meaning emerges from connection, that hope lives in the spaces between strangers, and that sometimes the smallest acts of courage, stopping instead of driving past, become the defining moments of our lives. Rachel had been right. Their meeting was no accident. It was a chance encounter with cosmic purpose. A moment of need met with a moment of generosity. A life saved that ended up saving another life in return. That's how healing works. That's how love begins. In the space between a question and an answer. In the moment when you choose to stop. Thank you so much for coming this far with this incredibly heartwarming story. If it touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, HQ Incredible Stories, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness changes everything. Drop a comment telling us about a time when a stranger's kindness changed your life, or when your kindness changed someone else's. We read every comment, and your stories inspire us to keep sharing these messages of hope. Until next time, remember, we're all just one act of compassion away from changing someone's entire world. See you in the next story.